When Montreal lost the Stanley Cup final to Tampa Bay last year, a very interesting reporter from Montreal said something very interesting. He said it would have been nice for Montreal to win their 25th Cup, but of course years ago Jack Walker took care of that for Seattle. And a lot of people didn't get the reference, but I did. Let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. If you've never heard about this player before, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. Probably one of the best defensive forwards of the pre-NHL era, and probably one of the best hockey players ever. I would expect he should be at least top 50. Hockey Hall of Fame member Jack Walker not only was a successful player, he excelled in at least 9 leagues, and invented or perfected something called a hook check, which is a cousin to the poke check. Now, John Philip Jack Walker, born November 29th, 1888, in Silver Mountain, Ontario, near Thunder Bay, was only 5'8", maybe 155 soaking wet, and he caused so much problems with his defensive style and his offensive style. He played in almost every heavily competitive league of his era, including a maritime league where he played for Moncton before he went full blown with Seattle Metropolitans. He's one of only a few players in NHL history to win 3 Stanley Cups with 3 different teams. In 1914 with the Toronto Blue Shirts, in 1979 with the Seattle Metropolitans in their big win over Montreal, and in 1925 with the Victoria Cougars. Now, what's interesting about Jack, he was a forward who played for, again, Toronto, Seattle, Victoria Cougars, and Detroit Cougars. He played in all the big professional leagues at the time, including the NHA, the PCHA, the Western Canada Hockey League, and the National Hockey League, and of course, in the Maritime League, which at the time was very strong. With his teammates on all 3 Stanley Cup winning squads. Again, he's one of only 11 players in Cup history to win Stanley with 3 or more different teams. Now, outside of his 3 Stanley Cup victories, he also appeared in 4 other incidences where his team played for the Stanley Cup, either in challenge games or in Stanley Cup series. The first was in 1911 with, get this, the Port Order Lake City, in 1919 and 1920 with Seattle Metropolitans, and in 1926 with the Victoria Cougars. In 1920, and 26, he was on the losing side of either the challenge game or the series. And in 1919, of course, the Stanley Cup series between Seattle and Montreal was cancelled because of the Spanish flu pandemic. Now, again, born in Silver Mountain, he grew up in Port Arthur, which is currently Thunder Bay, where his parents had lived since 1870. He played with the Port Arthur Lake City team in the new Ontario Hockey League, NOHL, from 07 to 12. On March 16, 1911, he and teammate Eddie Carpenter played for the Port Arthur Hockey Club against the Ottawa Senators of the NHA for the Stanley Cup. Carpenter and Walker each scored a goal, but Port Arthur lost 13-4 in front of 3,000 spectators at the Laurier Avenue Arena in Ottawa. Now, impressed by Walker's play in the Stanley Cup Challenge game, the Senators tried to land him for the 1912 season. But Walker declined the offers. He thought Port Arthur had a strong enough team to again compete for the Stanley Cup. For the 1912 season, future Hockey Hall of Fame members Harry Cameron and Frank Neighbor joined the Port Arthur team from Pembroke. But after the team defeated the Saskatoon Wholesalers 12-6 in a qualifying 2-game series on March 2nd and 4th, 1912, for a chance to challenge the NHA champions Quebec for the Cup, Port Arthur nonetheless turned down the opportunity because they felt they had practically no chance to defeat the NHA champions. Now, in 1913, Walker and Carpenter played for the Moncton Victorias of the Maritime Professional Hockey League, and Walker also played one initial game with the Toronto Blue Shirts of the NHA. Now, Walker had first signed a contract with Toronto Club for the 1913 season, but jumped contract to Moncton along with Fred Doherty after only one game in the NHA for a higher salary in the Maritimes. Rumor has it was $6,000. Now, in 1914, he became a full-time member of the Toronto Blue Shirts. Back in Toronto, Walker helped the Blue Shirts win the Stanley Cup by defeating Montreal. The two teams tied each other for first place in the NHA, and Toronto won the defending playoffs 6-2 total goal over 2 games on March 11th and 7th and 11th. The Blue Shirts then defeated the Victoria Aristocrats, champions of the PCHA, in 3 straight games, 5-2, 6-5, and 2-1, between March 14th and 19th. Now, Walker played with the Blue Shirts in 1915, but prior to the 1916 campaign, Lester and Frank Patrick, the men behind the PCHA, took advantage of a turbulent situation in the NHA when Major Frank Robinson ordered the Blue Shirts was about to sell his team to join the military. The Patricks raided the Blue Shirts and created a new PCHA powerhouse in the Seattle Metropolitans, stocking it with Walker, Carpenter, Harry Hap Holmes, Frank Foystein, and Carol Cully Wilson. Now, Metropolitans is where Walker had his biggest success. In his second season with Seattle, in 1917, he helped the American team to first place finish in the PCHA in front of the Vancouver Millionaires, Rosebuds, and Spokane Canaries. In the following Stanley Cup Finals, the Metropolitans defeated the Habs of the NHA 3-1 to claim the Stanley Cup, making the first time an American team had won the coveted trophy. Now, World War I had a big impact in the game, and prior to the 1918 season, Walker and Eddie Carpenter were stuck in Port Arthur working on a dry dock. They had been given exemption from the war on the condition that he continued their employment with the city, which held them out from rejoining the Metropolitans in the PCHA. Walker and Carpenter instead played with different Port Arthur teams in the NOHL. Now, back in the PCHA for the 1919 season, he again helped the Metropolitans reach the finals with a rematch against Montreal Canadiens planned. But the 1919 series was a more even affair than 1917, as the teams were tied 2-2 in a best-of-5, but because it was cancelled due to the Spanish flu pandemic when several players on the Habs ended up in sick in hospital. Joe Hall, a future Hockey Hall of Fame defenseman on the Habs team, subsequently died of pneumonia related to his influenza in a hospital in Seattle on April 5th, only 4 days after the series had been cancelled. In 1920, Walker again helped the Metropolitans to the Cup Finals, this time against the Senators. The Senators, led by neighbor, Walker's old teammate from Port Arthur, during the 1912 season, won the series 3-2 in a 6-1 decision in the deciding Game 5 on April Fool's Day, 1920. Now, Walker played 4 more seasons with Seattle, but when the team folded after the 24th season, Walker, along with teammates Hap Holmes and Foystein, joined the Victoria Cougars in the Western Canadian Hockey League for the 1925 season. Now, the Cougars, led offensively by their Icelandic-Canadian star forward Frank Fredriksson, only finished third in the 24-25 PCHL standings, WCHL standings, but they succeeded in winning the following league playoffs, defeating both the Saskatoon Crescents and the Calgary Tigers, which gave them the opportunity to play NHL champion Montreal for the Stanley Cup. Walker, who had a modest regular season offensively with the Cougars, turned it on for the playoffs, scoring 4 goals during the postseason and 4 goals in the Stanley Cup Finals, helping the Cougars knock off the Habs 3-1 while being matched against the Habs' young star, Howie Morenz. The 25 Cougars were the last non-NHL team to win the Cup. In 26, the team was back in the Stanley Cup Finals after winning the WHL playoffs, but the Montreal Maroons of the NHL were too difficult to overcome, winning their set 3-1, with Montreal goaltender Clint Benedict recording 3 shutouts in the series. Now, when the WHL folded after the 26th season, he moved along with the Cougars to Detroit in the NHL, where the team became the Detroit Cougars. Walker, then 37, played 2 seasons with Detroit in the NHL before heading back to Seattle, where he played 3 seasons with the Seattle Eskimos of the PCHL. During 32 and 33, Walker was a playing manager for, get this, the Hollywood Stars and the Oakland Sheiks in the California Hockey League, association where several other old PHA stars such as Moose Johnson, Lloyd Cook, and Fred Smokey Harris also played during the twilight years. Now, after his playing career, Walker stayed on the West Coast, where he was active as an ice hockey instructor. He finally settled down in Seattle, where he unfortunately died at a young age of 61 in 1950. He was inducted posthumously in the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1960. Now, Walker was what you call a rover, which is a term that was part of the archaic 7-man game forward position between defense and center forward, or in a 6-man game against opponents from the NHA as a winger. He was a terrific stick handler and had tremendous speed, something which both the Ottawa Journal and the Ottawa Citizen complimented him after the Port Arthur Lake City aggregation played the Senators for the Stanley Cup in 1911. Now, the Ottawa Journal said Walker and Rovers a crackerjack his skating and use of his famous poke check, making the most conspicuous figure on the ice. Now, his two-way play, again, it's called a hook check, but It's a cousin to the poke check. It's a defensive technique in which the player sweeps or hooks his stick low to the ice in an effort to remove the puck for an opponent's stick. Not a penalty in the NHL to this day. Now, Walker's forward teammate in the 1912 Port Arthur Lake City squad was Frank Neighbor, was another defensive specialist during the same era who excelled at both the Walker style, the poke check, and the sweep check. In a 1960 interview with Bill Westwick of the Ottawa Journal, Neighbor claimed that he learned his famous poke checking technique by watching Walker while the two players were teammates in Port Arthur. Now, one instance in which Walker used his hook check with great success was during the 17 finals against the Habs. The Canadians had won their first game in the best of 5, 8-4, but in Game 2, Walker put on the pressure and used his hook check to stop the great Didier Pitt, one of the star forwards on the Montreal team, who had countered 4 markers in the first contest, helping the team hold the Canadians to only 1 goal in a 6-1 victory. The Metropolitans then won Game 3 4-1 and Game 4 9-1, again becoming the first American team to win the Stanley Cup. Whether or not Walker came up with a hook check by himself or if he drew inspiration from contemporary players is disputed. Both Joel Rochon and William Bud Sorel, two players from Fort William whom Walker played against in the NOHL, claimed to have originated the check. Rochon's claims were echoed by Fort William native hockey Hall of Famer Jack Adams, who claimed Frank Neighbor must have learned of his poke check after having played against Rochon and Fort William in the NOHL, something Neighbor himself denied. Harry Scott, a teammate of Walker with the 1913 Moncton Victorias and an opponent of him in the NOHL between 07 and 11, claimed it was Bud Sorel who had taught Walker the check. Either way, Walker perfected it. So you can say he created the perfection of his hook check. In an era that was known for a lot of on-ice violence, Walker was known as a clean and gentlemanly player, which reflected not only the comparatively low amount of penalty minutes, but also in the low amount of serious injuries he suffered. One tough injury he did suffer happened during the 1922 season when he was hit over his already injured left hand in a game in Victoria on February 10th, and blood poisoning set into the wound. He was taken to General Hospital, where on February 13th he was operated on, and later came back and finished the season. Now, Patrick, the hockey mogul behind the PCHA and later a 2-time Stanley Cup winning coach with the Rangers, had high praise